Okay, we'll start now. So, welcome to the virtual Buddhist Society. Just make sure. Normally, I'd be welcoming you to our beautiful temple. Just putting everything on silent. So normally I'd be welcoming you to our beautiful temple, but in these COVID virus times, we're conducting all of our classes online. So I thought we could begin with some meditation. To start with the meditation, a little bit of awareness of our posture is important. Our physical posture, how we're sitting, is important. I'm sitting cross-legged on the ground. That's considered ideal if you're able to do that comfortably. And I've got a nice supporting cushion so I can keep a straight back without any discomfort. But sitting cross-legged is not essential. Sitting in a chair is fine. What is important is that we sit with a straight back. Comfortably straight back, that is. If our back's not straight, if we're slumping, then our meditation is not clear, and it's easy to become dull and sleepy. So having a straight back really is important. Our head should be inclined forward a little bit, not completely straight, looking straight ahead. Our hands are in our lap, with the right hand resting on top of the left hand and the thumbs touching gently. Elbows are held away from the sides of the body, not tucked in, but sort of held out. This sort of allows the air to circulate more freely around our torso, which again is useful for not promoting dullness. Eyes are half closed, or if we find that a little bit uncomfortable, then completely closed and loosely focused. Resting shut in a natural position. And so long as we don't have a blocked nose, then we breathe through the nose. Our tongue rests against our front upper palate. So check that we've allowed everything to relax. It's quite common that we're subconsciously tightening our shoulders or our face. So let the shoulders settle or our neck. So let the shoulders settle into a natural position. And then what we do is we focus our attention on the breath. So whilst breathing normally, not trying to control the breath in any way, simply observe the sensation of the breath passing through the nostrils. As you breathe in, observe, now I'm breathing in. As you breathe out, observe, Now I'm breathing out. So this process is quite different to our ordinary way of thinking. So ordinary way of thinking, we'll have one part of the mind thinking about this, thinking about that, another part of the mind watching the television. But with meditation, all of our mind, all of our attention is directed toward the object of concentration, the breath. So any other thought is considered a distraction. And when other thoughts do arise, we recognize that that they're arising, that we have become distracted, and then quite deliberately we turn our attention back to the breath. And what we're aiming to achieve is that all of our awareness is directed toward the breath with strong concentration to the exclusion of other thoughts. Our mind is completely filled with the awareness of the breath. So as I said, whilst breathing normally, not trying to control the breath, we practice this for a few minutes. Let body and mind settle, the mind becoming quiet, the body relaxing. We suspend our normal mental chatter, and with a very quiet, focused mind, we observe the breath. If the mind has wandered off down some rabbit hole, become distracted, that means we've lost the object of concentration. So recognizing distracted, cease following that train of thought and bring our awareness back to the breath. So that's just a few minutes of meditation. And that's explaining how to meditate, and to understanding how to meditate is very easy. But actually developing proficiency in meditation is much harder. So breathing meditation, which we've just done for a few minutes, is a really good foundation for starting a regular meditation practice. And if you're interested and you have the time, then I'd encourage you to do somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes. So let's say between 10 and 15 minutes meditation once a day. If your practice is consistent, I think you will start to notice changes and benefits really quickly, actually. So, as I said at the beginning, welcome to the virtual Tibetan Buddhist Society. In normal times, we would be holding this introductory series in our beautiful temple out in Europe, just north of Greenvale, surrounded by beautiful gardens. But today we're doing our meditation online, practice online. So my name's Michael Joseph. It's nice to meet everybody. I've been studying and practicing Tibetan Buddhism now for more than 40 years, and been leading meditations, introductory classes, and so forth for more than 30 years, for quite a long time now. So my contact with Buddhist system, Tibetan Buddhist thought, was when I met my teacher, Sarah J. Geshe Acharya Thubten Loden, which is quite a mouthful. So the Geshe is commonly known as Geshe, and I'll refer to him by that title. So Geshe is the Tibetan Buddhist equivalent of a professor, and La is a respectful, is an honorific. Geshe was born in Tibet at the age in 1924. At the age of 7, against his parents' wishes, he ran away from home to join the local village monastery. And then from there, eventually, he ended up in Lhasa in central Tibet, studying for his Geshe degree at Sarah J. Monastery. So the studies for the Geshe degree are intense, and it normally takes usually somewhere around 20 to 25 years for a monk to complete his Geshe studies. And during that time, they practice memorizing, debating, meditation every day. All of their activity is oriented around this study program. So Geshe completed his Geshe studies after more than 20 years of study at Sarah J. Monastery in Tibet. And then in 1959, during the Communist Chinese Cultural Revolution, the Communist Chinese, the PLA, occupied Tibet, bombed, shelled the monasteries, and took over and stopped the practice of any form of Buddhism within Tibet. So amongst 100,000 others, Geshe escaped from Tibet to India, and very quickly the Tibetan monks in exile resumed their Buddhist studies. Geshe completed his Geshe examination in the presence of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and is awarded the equal top of the class. Subsequently, His Holiness asked Geshe and a number of other Tibetans to study a master's degree at Varanasi Sanskrit University. So Geshe completed and was awarded the Acharya qualification. And then after that, then Geshe went to study at Yume Tantric College, which had been re-established in South India. And he spent 6 years studying Tantra at Yume Tantric College. Then in 1976, he was invited to come to teach in Australia by Lama Geshe. So Geshe taught at Shinraising Institute in Queensland for 3 years. And during that time, a number of people, myself included, met with Geshe, had the opportunity to learn a little bit from him. And we all thought that we'd really just barely drunk from the cup of Geshe's wisdom. So we formed an organisation to invite Geshe to come back to Australia. Geshe agreed. The Tibetan Buddhist Society was established in 1979, and then in 1980, Geshe returned to Australia. From then, he was based mainly in Australia, returning to India for a brief visit once every 2 years. And during his time at the Tibetan Buddhist Society, he wrote a series of books which became the basis of our teaching and practice curriculum. Geshe passed away in 2011. So the Tibetan Buddhist Society, we have centres in Melbourne, Perth, and Sydney. As I mentioned, we have a large temple in Europe. We also have a large temple in Perth. And we have a fairly extensive teaching program of classes for introduction, path to enlightenment, and advanced Vajrayana or Tantric meditation. And we have classes, the Melbourne Centre, we hold classes, 4 classes a week. This introductory series will go for 5 weeks. Its purpose is to provide a little bit of background into meditation and mindfulness, an introduction to Buddhist psychology and philosophy, and importantly, to introduce you to the practice of meditation. So by the time you've attended this series of 5 classes, you'll have a lot of what you need to start your own meditation practice. In fact, you'll have all that you need to be able to start your own meditation practice. In terms of learning to meditate, and in terms of listening to these sessions, there's absolutely no need for you to change your belief system. His Holiness Dalai Lama traveled the world extensively until fairly recently, gave public talks to thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people at a time. And commonly he would start those talks by saying, if you're a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew or atheistic or whatever, you should maintain your current system. You shouldn't contemplate changing to another system of belief. And certainly with learning how to meditate and learning sort of the key principles that underpin the Buddhist philosophical view and the psychology, the methods of training the mind, there's absolutely no need at all to change one's belief system. The practices and principles really are they're reason-based rather than faith-based. And I hope this will become a little bit clearer what I mean by reason-based as we continue today and in the subsequent talks. So although there's no need to change in any way, adjust anyone's belief system, there are principles and techniques and ideas that we'll introduce which you may want to incorporate. And your belief system may be an atheistic belief system, not believing in any a supreme creative being, or agnostic, being uncertain. But nonetheless, there'll be some ideas and some practices which you may find useful, and then you can fold them into your way of living. So the starting point in terms of listening to these classes is one of the a unique and special characteristic of being a human being is that we have a wonderful intelligence. We have the ability to contemplate, to analyze, and to reason, and then based on reasoning to come to informed decisions. So we should use our intelligence in contemplating this class today, but not only that, generally speaking. So a Buddhist principle is that nothing should be taken to be true just because someone says it is so. And it doesn't matter how famous that person is or how charismatic they are. We always should analyze what they say, investigate what they say before accepting that what they say to be truthful and or useful. And also, advice from one person to one group of people can be really useful for those people and may not be so useful for others. So we need to assess within our own experience and our own background the usefulness of what we're hearing. So this principle goes back to the time of the Buddha, and the Buddha advised his monastic students, that they should not accept what he taught out of respect, but that they should test his teachings in the same way that if someone was going to buy gold, they would carefully test the gold to see how pure it is before buying it. And so, quoting from the Buddha from 2,600 years ago, scholar bhikkhus is a word for monk, as gold is heated, cut and rubbed, practiced by properly analyzing my words, but not because of respect. So the Buddha was a major celebrity, had tens, hundreds of thousands of followers, and he strongly encouraged the students never ever to accept what he said just because of respect or belief in him, but to carefully assess. So I'd like to talk very briefly about where this system of teachings came from. One of the amongst the characteristics of a credible system of instruction is its provenance, where it came from. So if it comes from a well-credentialed source, is well explained, and if those people who follow that explanation benefit from them, then that supports the fact that that explanation, those teachings, that system, are useful for us. So I'll just give you a really brief background of the history of the Buddha, because although there's absolutely no need nor reason for people to become Buddhists to practice these teachings, this philosophy, psychology, and meditation practice. Nonetheless, what we explain, what we teach, does come directly from the Buddha. So if you're out at our temple, you would be surrounded by, behind me would be a huge Buddha statue, and then around lots of images of different Buddhas, different teachers, and so forth. So I'll just provide a little bit of context by explaining a little bit, very briefly, about the Buddha. So the Buddha was born 2,600 years ago in India. At the time, India was a wealthy country with many Maharajas. The prevalent religion was Hinduism, and there was a strong tradition of Hindu yogis and ascetics, Hindu monks, who sort of renounced their worldly life to go and practice meditation. The Buddha was born to a king as part of in the Sakya lineage, and even from the early days, it was obvious he was an unusual boy. His father knew that his son was unusual and was concerned that he could easily be attracted to a spiritual life. So his father sheltered him within the palace and tried to isolate him from the world outside. However, the Buddha did at one time travel away from the palace, and he observed he observed some very old, sick, frail, elderly people, and recognized that there's discomfort or unhappiness or suffering that's associated with becoming old. He also saw somebody who was sick, and he recognized sickness brings problems and unhappiness. And then he observed somebody dying, and he said, well, then he thought, we all are going to experience different sicknesses in our lives, such different discomforts and unhappiness in our lives, such as becoming sick, getting old, and dying. And all of these things bring problems. The Buddha also observed a very attractive and peaceful Hindu monk. So, based on these observations, the Buddha, he wasn't the Buddha then, he was Prince Siddhartha then, based on these observations, Prince Siddhartha questioned whether leading a ordinary life, albeit one of wealth and privilege as a prince and ultimately king, was ultimately fulfilling and would bring sustainable happiness. And he decided that no, through a worldly life necessarily is accompanied by various discomforts, discontentment, and sometimes by strong suffering, such as experienced through sickness, aging, and death. So the Buddha said, I don't want to live a life like this. I want to find a way to end my suffering permanently and to gain deep and sustainable happiness, enduring happiness. And not only that, I want to find a method that is not only useful for me, but is useful for everybody, that other people also can use. So the Buddha then ran away from the kingdom to the opposition of his father. And then he traveled around India and studied with many great teachers, Hindu teachers, learned meditation and so forth. He also used his own intelligence to question and understand what he had learned, and then based on what he'd learned and based on his own investigations and reasoning, he then practiced intensive meditation, including a 6-year meditation retreat, and then ultimately meditating under the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya in India, he completely eliminated all negative mind and all negative states, and also completely eliminated any aftermath or any stain on the mind, on the mental continuum of those, and he gained complete and perfect Buddhahood or enlightenment. So Buddha is a Sanskrit word which translates as awakened. So the name Buddha was given to Prince Siddhartha by his students. They called him Awakened One or Buddha. So that was the name by which he was known from that time onwards. So the Buddha traveled around India for just over 40 years. He established a huge following of people who ultimately became monks and nuns who wanted to learn to practice as he had practiced and to gain the same results that he had gained. And then from that, the Buddhist system of practice and meditation and teachings was established. So his students learned from him, and then they explained what they'd learned to their students. And then through this, Buddhism spread throughout much of Asia, north to China, Korea, Japan, and Tibet, south to Sri Lanka, a country now called Sri Lanka, Vietnam, Thailand, Kampuchea, Laos, and so forth. So Buddhism flourished in India from 400 BC up until 800 BC. The biggest and most famous monastery, which is now an archaeological site in India, was Nalanda Monastery, and at its peak times, it had a community of 30,000 monks and nuns. intensively studying and practicing the Buddhist system. And some of Nalanda's great, Tibetans invited some of Nalanda Monastery's great teachers to come to Tibet to teach, and some famous teachers such as Shantirakshita, Pamasabhava, Kamalashila, and Natisha travelled from India and taught Buddhism in Tibet between the 8th and the 10th century AD. So in this way, Indian Buddhism travelled to Tibet. And step by step, most of the Buddhist texts were translated from Sanskrit into Tibetan. And a tradition of Buddhist scholasticism was established in Tibet, with countless books being written by great Tibetan scholars. So by 1950, Tibet had more than 6,000 monasteries, and a quarter of its male population were monks. So the monastery that Geshe studied at, Sarah Monastery, had around 5,500 resident monks. These days, Tibetan Buddhism has been re-established in South India, and the monasteries are again flourishing. And Sarah Monastery in Bilakupa, south of Bangalore, now has around 4,000 monks. So our system of practice comes directly from Buddha, and his teachings were in India, then were travelled to Tibet, and then travelled to Australia. So that's a really sort of a very brief explanation of how Buddhism came through to the modern times. What is interesting about Buddhism is its emphasis on reasoning. So the monk scholars, in addition to memorizing hundreds, if not thousands, of pages verbatim of Buddhist text, also are trained in dialectics, in debate. So the reason for this, in debate, they have to defend a position against questions. And the reason for the dialectics is to help them to get to the very essence of the meaning of the Buddha's words, to help ultimately to maintain the purity of the Buddha's teachings, but also to support their own meditation practice. So Buddhism, the practice of meditation, is typical of what commonly motivates our actions, in as much as everybody wants happiness and nobody wants unhappiness. Nobody wants pain or suffering. Nobody wants isolation because of coronavirus. Nobody wants millions of people to become sick. Nobody wants to be separated from dear friends and family. Everybody wants happiness, and more happiness and enduring happiness. So in this way, the reason that Buddhists practice the Buddhist system of philosophy, psychology, and meditation is to increase happiness and to reduce unhappiness, to increase happiness not only for oneself but for everybody, and to reduce unhappiness not only for oneself but for others as well. and also ultimately to gain a state of peacefulness and happiness that is enduring, is never interrupted, and also is also entails or means the complete and permanent elimination of all unhappiness. So our normal way of so as I said, what generally motivates pretty much everybody most of the time is the dual objectives of gaining happiness and when we have unhappiness and sometimes suffering, to remove that unhappiness and suffering. What we think is axiomatic, that we generally haven't questioned until now, is that we assume that our happiness and our or for that matter, our unhappiness, arise directly and dependently on circumstances. So if we have all of the good, favorable circumstances, then we will have happiness. But if we have bad conditions or meet with bad circumstances, then we'll have unhappiness. And to an extent, this is valid. So if we are doing something that we really enjoy, that makes us happy. So doing something that we really enjoy is enjoying good circumstances. Or if we're doing something that we really dislike, that makes us unhappy, such as, for example, being stuck in isolation for 6 weeks, or watching our business go backwards and backwards because it has no income. Then that brings unhappiness. So we conclude that good things bring happiness, bad things, meeting with bad things, brings unhappiness. And therefore, based on that, and that's not what we're taught, it's actually what we experience. So based on that, then we try to gain more and have more and more good conditions, and to have fewer and fewer bad conditions. So generally speaking, these dual goals, we have mixed success. But we think, well, I've had mixed success and it's been quite good. If I was completely successful, then my life would be perfect. Everything would be happy. There would be no unhappiness. And everything being perfect means having all of the material conditions and circumstances that are the basis of happiness, and being free of all the physical, material circumstances and conditions which are causes of unhappiness. And we might even have some sort of mental picture of what that would mean. It might mean having $1 or $2 million in the bank so we don't have to work, spending time with wonderful people, being surrounded by nice people, a nice environment, being healthy, being able to do the things we enjoy, not having to do unpleasant things, not having to associate with difficult, challenging people, having a very easy, comfortable life. For other people, it might mean having a very, very successful career, or having unbelievable possessions, a mansion in the city, a holiday house at the beach, an apartment at the snow, driving this or that European car, or whatever. For other people, it might be being surrounded by the rich and the famous. So we all have, we set for ourselves particular things that we want to have or to achieve in order to be happy. And the implication of that is that when we achieve those things, we ought to be happy. But that actually never works. We can never gain enduring happiness through material circumstances, and because our mind is habitually it's never contented. It's whatever we have, it's never enough. So when we were learning to drive a car, by way of example, we think, oh, look, when I have my driver's license, it'll be fantastic. I'll have freedom. When we get our driver's license, we think, if I had my own car, it'd be fantastic. So we get a second-hand car, which is not so great. Then we get the second-hand car and we think, oh, this is terrific. Then 2 or 3 months later, we look at what our friends are driving and we see other cars on the road and we think, I don't want a second-hand car, I want a new car. And then we think, oh, okay, we get our new car, which is a modest car, a Korean or a Japanese car. And we think, oh, this is fantastic, got this new car, perfect. And we have that new car for 2 or 3 months and we think, this car's too small and it's not very comfortable, I like a bigger car. And we get a bigger car, then we say, I want a European car. Then we get this or that European car, it's fantastic for a while, we want a different car. And it continues. Whatever car we have, for a while we gain, for a while, 1, 2, 3 months, it's brilliant. But then we become dissatisfied, we want something different. So, so this isn't a Dharma talk about, or a Buddhist talk about cars, but cars are emblematic of how whatever we have, whatever we achieve, we never find satisfaction. It's never sufficient. So again, when we're younger, we think if I had my own room in a shared accommodation house, that'd be fantastic. Then we think if I had my own rented house, that would be fantastic. Then we think if I own my own home, that would be fantastic. Then we get a home in an affordable area. Then we think if I had my home in somewhere that's closer to the city, that would be fantastic. Then we think if my home were bigger and had a nice garden, that would be fantastic. Or I need a home movie cinema system, that would be fantastic. We get that home, we think, one home's great, but I'd like to have somewhere where I can go to the beach on the weekends. So then we want a holiday home. So in the same way with cars, with our accommodation or our abode, we never reach a point where we think, this is perfect, this is all I need, I'm so happy because of that. And I'll come and explain what's actually going on that sort of underpins this constant striving for more and more or something different all the time. Because possessions, material comforts are easily achieved with wealth, we think that if we were wealthy, when we're wealthy, we'll be happy. And also because how our material comforts are dependent on our wealth, we naturally think that the wealthier we are, the happier we will be. And this is actually wrong. There's no science to support that the wealthier we are, the happier we are. And in fact, there is some science that says that the more we strive for wealth, the less contentment we have, the unhappier we are. If wealth were a cause of happiness, then great wealth would be a cause of great happiness. But the really wealthy in the world do not, generally speaking, gain happiness and never gain enduring happiness just by virtue of wealth. So, for example, James Packer, very, very wealthy Australian young man with so much wealth he could never, ever spend it all in his lifetime, has had all sorts of challenges, has had to step down from his business, has had to go and spend time in hospital, has had, I think, several marriages, has moved from this place and that place, and has self-acknowledged depression. He's actually said the reason I'm stepping away from my company is to deal with mental health issues. So James Packer had beautiful partners. It was a $100 million yacht, so on and so forth. But by his own admission, he's not happy, or was not happy. Also, if we so not only do we Australians think that wealth, good conditions are the cause of happiness, if we, I've spent a lot of time traveling in India, observed the conditions in India. If we went to rural India and explained our conditions as an Australian, and we said we have access to free medical care, free dental care. If we don't have a job, the government supports us. Generally, we have accommodation that's warm in winter, cool in summer. We have enough to eat and access to clean water. Describing that to not just India, but to a poor, impoverished person, wherever they might live, they would think that, oh, that life sounds like heaven. But for us who have all the necessities we need to live comfortably, generally speaking, none of us would think this is perfect, this is heaven. There's always something that is unsatisfactory. Also, pursuing material comfort and good conditions makes us tired, it causes fatigue, stress, anxiety. We worry about our investments and causes confusion. Do I do this? Do I do that? Through pursuing wealth and good conditions, we make ourselves miserable through jealousy and competition, and also particularly for completely depending on conditions for happiness. We're never content and relaxed, and our mind is never settled. There's always one or other anxiety. And also, if we're realistic, we have to say that, look, all of these things I aspire to as a young person, perhaps I want to go and study, I want to become an academic, or as a young person we aspire to becoming a brain surgeon or a pilot or whatever. We have all of these different, not just young people, middle-aged people, old people have aspirations. We have all of these different aspirations and things that we want, and we think that if we get them, that'll be fantastic, we'll be happy. Unfortunately, commonly, we are unsuccessful in achieving much of what we aspire to. And this failure to gain what we so want to achieve can bring unhappiness, and for some people, intense unhappiness. So, as I said, it's not invalid or incorrect to say that good conditions can help with happiness, but not necessarily. If the mind's completely confused, distracted, and depressed, good conditions bring no happiness at all. And for ordinary people, bad conditions bring unhappiness. So if we're a bit tired, we're a bit sick, or our investments are going downhill, whatever, then it's for ordinary people, these sorts of circumstances bring unhappiness. But neither good conditions are not a necessary and sufficient cause for happiness. And similarly, bad conditions do not necessarily bring suffering or unhappiness, because both happiness and unhappiness are states of mind. So having a wonderful house, a luxurious mansion, is not happiness. The possessing of a mansion is a physical thing. Whether or not it brings happiness is how we relate with having this fantastic house. Having a relationship with the person of our dreams is not happiness, it's just a relationship. The happiness depends on our response to that particular condition. So what Buddhist thought brings that is a little bit different to what we normally consider in terms of wishing to gain happiness and unhappiness is that the Buddhist focus is on mind. Almost ultimately, all of the Buddhist system of thought and practice is 100% is about the mind. It does have, so it's all about training the mind. All of the Buddhist teachings are how to develop mind to remove unhappiness and to gain happiness. So what is mind? I'll explain by way of example. When we're unconscious, or in a really, really very, very deep sleep, then our mind is more or less inactive. But we have a body, we have a brain, the heart is beating, we're breathing in and out. So the physiology is more or less the same, but when we're unconscious or deeply asleep, our mind is not aware, is inactive. So what does it mean by not aware? It's not aware of things going on around us. So if we're unconscious, then we don't hear sounds. If we're unconscious, we don't perceive sights. If we're unconscious, our normal mental chatter has stopped. We don't have thoughts. We're not thinking about the past, the present, or the future. We're not thinking, I want this, I don't want that. So when we're deeply asleep or unconscious, then the mind is largely inactive. We don't have experiences, we don't have happiness or unhappiness. So, but when we're conscious, then the mind is active. The mind is experiencing. So the general explanation of what is the mind in one sentence, it is that which experiences. So through the through through the vehicle of the eye, we see things, but it's the mind that experiences the object of sight. If even though our eyes are open and things are appearing before us, if our mind is diverted to something else, we may not even be aware of what we're seeing through the eyesight. So, for example, we could go to a movie, and we sit through an hour and a half of a movie. Or these days we sit in front of the television and play a movie on streaming in these days of isolation. But if our mind is completely distracted by some other problem, then at the end of the movie, then somebody asks us, what did you think? What did you see? And sometimes we can't remember anything that we saw during the movie. So the mind, the first level, the mind is the experiencer of appearances. Appearances to eyesight, for example, visible forms. Appearance to hearing, sounds. Appearances to nose sense, odors. Appearance to taste sense, tastes. Appearance to body sense, the experience of different types of touch, of heat and cold, and so forth. So when we are taking an object of sight, so the object appears before us, and the eye consciousness observes the shape and colour. The mental consciousness, the mind recognizes the shape and color and says, "Oh, that is a beautiful person." Then, so there are two things going on with appearance: the appearance, the object to mind, and the recognition of the characteristics, saying that thing appearing to mind is the person. So, for example, we could be watching a movie, and then the villain appears before us, and we think, oh, he or she is the villain. He is really, really evil person. So the next function of mind is to observe something, and then we respond with one of three feelings, or what we have three different types of reaction to what we observe, assuming that we observe it. As I said before, if we're distracted, we may not even observe it. So whether we observe something depends on mind. When we're distracted, we don't observe it. Our reaction or our response to our observation is to think, is it with a feeling of, I like it, I dislike it, or neither of the two. So we perceive something that's attractive, we think, I like it. If we perceive something that's unattractive, we think, I dislike it. And with like and dislike, we have an accompanying response of happiness or unhappiness. And the third, I said there were three types of responses. The third type is a neutral response, neither happiness nor unhappiness. So, for example, if we see a tree, we might have a neutral response, thinking it's neither makes us happy nor unhappy. So the second way the mind behaves is to think, to have a positive response or a negative response. And positive or negative depends on mind. If we like something, if it is something that we think is something we like, we respond positively. If we dislike it, we respond to it negatively. We think that the response is dependent on the object perceived, but actually that's not correct. The response is dependent on us. So the same thing appearing to two different people that can have entirely different responses. For the vegetarian, a strongly smelling charcoal piece of steak, very raw and running with blood, appears awful. For the steak lover, the same sort of steak appears very, very attractive. For the vegetarian, their response is unhappiness and nausea. For the steak lover, there's attraction and the saliva begins to flow, and I think, I so look forward to eating the steak. So we have the appearance of the thing, the reaction, whether it's not, we think it's a nice thing or a bad thing, and the response, happiness or unhappiness. All of these things depend on our mind. People with different minds respond differently. So if our mind is in a bad place, is anxious or flat or down or miserable, continuously miserable, then whatever we experience is colored by that mental state. And it doesn't matter what we experience, it doesn't bring any happiness whatsoever. On the other hand, if our mind is peaceful, joyous, uplifted, full of love, compassion, and relaxed, then we have continuous happiness dependent on on having a mind that is so positive. And then the difficulties and challenges we experience can bring little or no unhappiness. So the Buddhist path is to train the mind. And to train the mind so that it becomes more and more disposed, inclined to positive responses. And so the negative responses become are reduced and ultimately, eventually eliminated. So how do we train the mind? The reason we want to train the mind is to remove negative responses and to cultivate positive responses. We train the mind through the dual practices of mindfulness and meditation. So meditation, and the last time I did a search for the word meditation on Google, it said there, I got a response of more than 100 million hits. So meditation in a Buddhist context has a very specific meaning. And its meaning is to place the mind with clarity and without distraction on a positive object. So a positive object could be, for example, the breath, or it could be compassion or generosity, kindness. But it's not like we just think, I want that person to be free of unhappiness, which is compassion. It's where our mind is completely filled with that thought with no distraction. So through training and meditation, our concentration becomes stronger and stronger, and we have less and less distraction. So we meditate maybe for, in the beginning, 10, 15 minutes a day, and then as we become better, we increase that and maybe meditate a half an hour a day or an hour a day, and then maybe twice a day for an hour at a time. And through this, our concentration improves. So the meditation is necessary, as I explained it at the beginning. It involves sitting still, withdrawing our mind away from the objects of the senses, and placing mental consciousness on the object of meditation. So with meditation, we're watching our mind, and when it becomes distracted, maybe thinks about this bad thing or that bad thing, we deliberately bring our mind away from this distraction back onto the object of concentration when we're sitting in our meditation session. So mindfulness, particularly, we practice between meditation sessions. So you've probably heard an awful lot about mindfulness. What Western medicine or Western practice or Western science teach as mindfulness, all that practice of mindfulness comes directly from the Buddhist teachings. They can trace back to what the Buddha taught. So what mindfulness means, amongst other things, is always being mindful or aware of what our mind is doing. So if we find our mind dwelling on bad things that have happened in the past, where previously we would just let the mind continue to negatively and unproductively dwell on bad things, with mindfulness say, I'm doing this, I'm dwelling on these bad things. All that is doing is making me unhappy. I am going to take my mind away from this negative train of thought and bring it back to the present. So what mindfulness involves is having one part of mind which is vigilant, which is watching the mind, and then making sure that we don't become, that our mind doesn't follow negative path or a path that necessarily will bring us unhappiness. So in actual fact, Buddhism, the system of teaching, says not only does happiness depend on mind, and similarly unhappiness depends on mind, happiness is solely dependent on mind. If we develop positive mental attitudes so that they become stronger and stronger and last longer and longer, then ultimately we can train the mind so that they're with us all the time. And if we have positive attitudes, positive appearances, and positive thoughts, responses, then we have happiness. Similarly, if we can train our mind to have less and fewer negative traits, negative ways of thinking, then over time, these negative minds, these negative mental habits become weaker and less frequent. And when those negative ways of thinking are completely gone or eliminated, then because unhappiness necessarily arises from negative minds, then unhappiness is eliminated. So once we've eliminated negative mental states, then it doesn't matter what we meet, it brings no unhappiness. If we're able to manage and reduce our negative mental states, then problems, situations which used to cause us major stress and anxiety, we find now we can deal with them. We're productive. They cease to cause the same amount of grief with us that they used to. So over the next 4 weeks, and then this is the first week, the first of the 5, we'll be talking about how to train the mind, how positive negative what are the positive and negative states of mind, how they function, and what are their opponents, and how to develop positive minds, and how to eliminate, reduce, and control, and eventually eliminate negative minds. So it's just gone past 2:45. I've got time. I'm happy to take any questions. Does my explanation of does the Buddhist explanation of meditation, does that surprise you, or is it different to what you might have thought that meditation was? Oops, my connection's just dropped out. We're being reconnected. Okay, I'm back up. Well, I'm sorry, my connection just dropped out. Do you have any questions? Come on. So the question is, I don't have to repeat the question because you can all see, is it possible to have material things and still find happiness? So the Buddha was quite clear that material things are not, having material things and good conditions, having possessions are not at all a cause of unhappiness. With material things, actually having good conditions and circumstances gives us freedom to train the mind. Whereas if we're really struggling just to survive, then it's very difficult to develop a practice of meditation. So the Buddha never ever taught that in order to make spiritual progress, we have to abandon our possessions. And in fact, with good conditions, then it's actually possible. We can actually create generosity for others. So the path to happiness is not. It does not entail in any way whatsoever getting rid of our possessions. There's no contradiction. But on the other hand, if what motivates most, if not all, what we do, what dominates our thinking is, I want this, I want that, more and more, then that makes us unhappy. So it's the attitude that determines whether our material circumstances cause us happiness, unhappiness, or neither. The Buddha never ever taught that in order to become very progressed or even to gain complete enlightenment Buddhahood, we had to give up our possessions. So, for example, one king, Indrabodhi, he was a king. He had a kingdom, a royal family. He was very, very rich. He didn't give up any of these, but through his profound meditation practice, he was able to gain complete enlightenment. So possessions are not an obstacle to meditation or to spiritual progress. Being obsessed with possessions is. Thanks, Cherie. What's your son's name? Hi, Frank. So are people finding how are people finding isolation? Are they finding it stressful? My own observation is that if we naturally assume that our happiness depends on doing stuff, spending time with friends, going here or there or whatever, and then we can't do stuff, then that can be quite difficult. But the Buddhist view is that if we practice meditation, mindfulness, then we become less dependent on external entertainments for our happiness, and then sort of having sort of quiet time, isolation, if you like, can actually become enjoyable. So bored and concerned are the response to isolation. So boredom means I think comes from not being able to do the things that we're used to doing. And therefore, it's unhappiness through missing out on those things. But the response of becoming bored or being bored is it's a mental, it's mind. So boredom is not produced by conditions or circumstances. Boredom is a response to conditions or circumstances. If we're used to being continuously entertained, then to transition to a time or being usually being entertained or occupied with being occupied with things, then when we lose that, then our response is with boredom. So there's no quick answer how to fix that now. But what I will say that is, if we become trained in cultivating mental peace through meditation and mindfulness, then boredom, then being missing out on our usual entertainments becomes less and less of a problem. Also, anxiety, the way that anxiety functions is that it's a mental cycle. The mind is spinning or turning on a particular problem. So it might be anxiety. Oh, this virus is terrible. I could get it easily. If I get it, I'm going to be sick. I can have all sorts of problems. I must not get this virus. That's the cycle of thought. But with anxiety, we go through that sequence not once, but again and again and again. So this mental churning or spinning is non-productive because it doesn't take us to a place where we're not worrying, not unhappy. It can just, this mental dwelling continuously on a problem takes the problem and makes it much worse. So the way we find with anxiety is we continuously have at the back of our mind this concern. In fact, we might even have at the back of our mind when we're sleeping. In the first moment when we wake up is, I'm worried about something. What is that worrying? So what meditation and mindfulness, when we're practicing meditation, if we're doing it somewhat successfully, then the mental chatter is ceased. We're only observing the breath. So these anxious thoughts are suspended when we're practicing meditation. When we're practicing mindfulness, then if it's between the meditation sessions, then the anxious thought comes up and we say, this is my stupid, anxious mind. I'm worried about something I can't change. I'm going to turn my mind to something else. So through practicing mindfulness, we are actually training ourselves not to be worried or anxious. It sounds obvious. It's easy to say. It's obviously it takes training, but I would suggest to you that you may now already have the tools to start to practice meditation and mindfulness. And I think that if you do so properly and consistently, I think within 2 to 4 weeks, you'll start to notice some benefits. Looking at the responses. So just time for one last question. It's really interesting to read people's responses to how isolation is treating them. It's worth thinking about remembering the quote from a famous, I think, 6th century Indian Buddhist scholar, Shantideva. And I'll give you this quote to conclude with. He said, if it can be remedied, why worry about it? And if it cannot be remedied, then what is the use of worrying about it? So with a problem, it can either be resolved, and we know how to resolve it, so it's not a problem. If it can't be resolved, we can't make any difference, then there's no point worrying about it. So we'll finish now. Thanks so much for coming. It was really great to have this opportunity to speak with you, and we continue next week, and I look forward to the next session.